We're going to turn now to an extraordinary panel to talk about what I think of as sort of macro issues in the hemisphere. It's a time of, as we've suggested in our opening comments, considerable ferment, considerable dynamism, and considerable areas that are manifestly of concern to those who love freedom. The congressman has pointed to several very hopeful developments, specifically the triumph of freedom in Honduras against long odds, and the respect for the Constitution in Colombia. And it will be with sort of those hopeful signs as very much in mind that we will turn to some of the signs that are not quite so hopeful. We're going to be hearing from 4 experts in this first panel, both, I think, with respect to their topics and more generally with respect to the hemisphere. I'll introduce each of them in turn, and then we'll go through the list, and I'll simply recognize them to take up the cudgel. I'm going to ask each of them to respect the 10-minute rule here in the Congress, and we'll hopefully have thereby some time for questions from you all.
I want to clarify that 10 minutes is twice as much as a normal member of Congress is allowed.
It's the rule sometimes observed on the Senate side. I think you're right.
No, they never observe time limits on the Senate, but that's another issue. I think what happens is if the buzzer went off, they couldn't hear it anyways.
A festering problem between the houses there that you can appreciate. Our first speaker will be Dr. Luis Fleischman. We're very proud that he is a senior advisor to the Center for Security Policy's Menges Hemisheric Security Project. He also is an Adjunct Professor at the Wilkes Honor College at Florida Atlantic University. Luis will be speaking about the very important relationship between the sorts of internal developments that we'll be talking about throughout the morning, throughout the region, and the security of the region more generally. He'll be followed by Jon Perdue, the director of the Latin American programs at the Fund for American Studies. Jon is an expert on many issues in this region, but will be speaking to us today about asymmetric warfare, its growing use in both Central and South America, and its implications for all of us. Jon will be followed by Gustavo Coronel, one of the folks who has fled, I guess it's fair to say. Hugo Chavez's Venezuela. He is a geologist and political scientist. Was formerly on the board of PDVSA. Also served as a Venezuelan congressman. So welcome to our congressman. You will be speaking, as I understand it, about the rise and fall of the Bolivarian Revolution. That actually sounds rather hopeful, so we'll look forward to that. And then the cleanup batter for this first panel will be Dr. Norman Bailey, a friend and colleague of mine of many years, served with great distinction on President Reagan's National Security Council, and was instrumental to many of the very important things that were accomplished during that presidency. It's great to have you with us. He is now a consulting economist and president of the Institute for Global Economic Growth, and also is a member of the faculty of the Institute of World Politics. And Norman will be speaking about an issue that was touched on by Congressman Rosleitnen, the growing Iranian presence in Central and South America and what it means for the region and for us. So with that, Luis, welcome, and 10 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Congressman Bilbray and Connie Mack, for sponsoring this event, and also to Frank and Nancy and the Center for Security Policy for putting this wonderful event together. A large part of the Latin American continent today is in danger of falling into a situation that fluctuates between totalitarianism and anarchy, and between authoritarianism and chaos. The region is also in danger of falling under the influence of insurgent and terrorist groups, drug cartels, and distant countries that historically have been poles apart from the region, from the region's culture and civilization, mainly Iran, China, and Russia. The expansion of these events cannot be understood without understanding the presence and the expansion, the ideological and physical expansion of the Bolivarian revolution. In this presentation, I will try to bring some insight into the implication of such combination of factors for the region and try to anticipate some future scenarios in terms of national security and regional security. Venezuela under Hugo Chavez established a model of government and ideology that has implications on domestic as well as on foreign policy, and both are related. Domestically, there is an attempt to impose the Bolivarian revolution, which is a sort of absolutist socialism. In other words, an attack on private property, an attack on the market, and obviously also suppression of civil society, political society, the freedom of expression, and also the judiciary. In terms of foreign policy, Hugo Chavez is trying to expand this revolution to the continent, supposedly to impose his own hegemony on the continent as against what he perceives as being the US hegemony on in the continent. So domestically, the model of Hugo Chavez of suppression of civil society and political society is being reproduced in the countries that follow the Chavista model. These are mainly Ecuador and Bolivia, Nicaragua obviously too, and my guess is that other countries may follow. It's not clear yet. But under the veil of pursuing social justice, they have sought to strengthen and perpetuate executive power by using the momentary popularity of the president, like constitutional reform and others. But the model of internal repression, in fact, or the this domestic absolutism, also has implications on foreign policy, because the continental revolution, the expansion of the Chavez revolution can be done only by talking to a handful of people. In other words, the continent will be in the hand of 3 or 4 people that are not accountable to Congress, that they are not accountable to public opinion, and they are not accountable to civil society at all. And this is one of the main dangers of having these human rights violations and this absolutism. Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution is also trying to reach out to insurgent, or not insurgent, but grassroots movements and indigenous movements. But of course, Hugo Chavez is not going to wait for these movements to give him legitimacy. Hugo Chavez is a true revolutionary, and therefore the use of violence is crucial for every revolutionary movement. So, and no better ally for Hugo Chavez than the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, also known as the FARC. The FARC is being defeated in Colombia, and as the FARC is being defeated, it's moving to other countries. For instance, in Ecuador and Bolivia, you have a strong presence of FARC operatives. The FARC no longer, in my opinion, in my view, is going to be a pure movement trying to change the situation in Colombia, but at this point has become part of the Bolivarian Revolution. In other words, there is a new group that FARC and Chavez created together called the Bolivarian Continental Coordinator, or CCB. And the CCB, they met 2 months ago, and the members of ETA participated there. And obviously, the aim of the CCB is to spread insurgency and to promote insurgency across Latin America on behalf of the Bolivarian Revolution. And of course, there is a possibility that Middle Eastern groups could join that particular activity of promoting insurgency. Another point I want to stress here is the nature of the relation between the Bolivarian Revolution and the drug cartels. Drug business has always existed, but according to a report published last year by the Government Accountability Office, Venezuela has extended the lifeline to drug cartels. At this point, the flow of cocaine transited from Venezuela to the US, Europe, and West Africa increased more than 4 times between 2004 and 2007, and continues to sharply increase. At this point, the drug business continues to expand all across Latin America, including Central America, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Peru, and certainly the Caribbean. what the importance of the drug business is that it corrupts the institutions of the state, undermines the authority of the state. Drug money can buy lawyers, judges, policemen, politicians, everything. And this is even aggravated by the fact that Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela expelled the Drug Enforcement Administration from their countries. And no better example to show what the drug business can do, or the drug cartels, is take the example of Mexico and Guatemala. In Mexico, the Mexican states that border the US, there is no, in those states, there is no real distinction between members of the police and members of the drug cartels. The police is all taken over by drug cartels. In Guatemala, Guatemala has to hire private security companies in order to exercise control over the country, because the police and the military, or I would say the authorities, the regular authorities, cannot exercise control, or what is called the monopoly of the means of violence in Guatemala. So what is being created here with the help of Hugo Chavez, but not only, as I said, the drug cartels existed before, is a situation of anarchy, a situation similar to the one that is experienced by Afghanistan today, where basically the state, the authority of the state is weak, and the power is in the hands of non-state groups or warlords. This situation can perpetuate itself even if Chavez were to disappear. So in other words, even if Chavez is gone tomorrow, this situation of Afghanization is already a situation that should be of deep concern for the United States, and particularly when it is happening in our own backyard. But Chavez would tend to take advantage of this state of anarchy in order to tilt those countries toward the revolution. In terms of Iran, obviously this situation makes easy for groups such as the Hezbollah and others to penetrate the region. As you know, there is already cooperation between Hezbollah and Mexican drug cartels. Mexican drug cartels have access to the southern border of the United States, so this is a real physical danger coming from that area. Hezbollah can take advantage of this. In addition, there is another element that is happening, is that young Venezuelans are being trained in Hezbollah camps in southern Lebanon. That was reported, I think, about a year ago. This is extremely important because members of the Hezbollah or Venezuelan-trained Hezbollah or the Revolutionary Guards, as it was reported yesterday by the Pentagon, could play a role in keeping the totalitarian nature of Chavez and his allies' regimes. Remember, there is a new law today in Venezuela that establishes a militia above the army, and this militia can include Venezuelan-born or foreign-born people. Now, if that is the case, it should not be ruled out that the militia could be composed by members of the FARC, Middle Eastern groups, and other dangers. Regarding Iran, there is another issue, which is Iran and the nuclear issue. Venezuela has been the staunchest supporter of Iran, has also facilitated its banking system to Iran, and reportedly has also produced uranium for Iran. So what Chavez is going to ask Iran in return? I think what we should not rule out is the possibility that once Iran becomes nuclear, and that's a possibility, Venezuela will become nuclear, particularly when Venezuela is arming itself, is promoting antagonism with Colombia, and at this point, the Venezuelan army is no match for Colombia. So for Chavez having a nuclear weapon, I think this is a real possibility that should not be ruled out. Here I'm being told that I have 2 more points, but I think I'm going to defer it to the question and answer period.
That'd be a good idea.
Yes, I'll be happy if you can ask me later. Thank you so much,
We
Frank.
will try to ensure that there is time to ask what it is he didn't get to say, but
Okay.
thank you very much for what you did say. Luis, Jon Perdue on the growing asymmetric warfare in Central and South America. Welcome.
Thanks, Frank. Those of you that saw yesterday the Bill Gertz piece in the Washington Times about Iran expanding the number of Quds Force in Venezuela, it made a really good lead into what I want to talk about this morning, asymmetric warfare, or what the estimable Max Manwaring calls fourth-generation warfare. This morning in the Washington Times, there was also an article about the fact that after a year and a half of the hopeful new diplomacy of constructive engagement, that Hezbollah now has Scud missiles. And the Obama administration had been working for a good year and a half to convince them by force of personality, I would assume, to not give Scud missiles, for Syria not to give Scud missiles to Hezbollah. So I fear that might be a leading indicator of what may come to be the result of this type of foreign policy. It's like the theory of third marriage is the triumph of hope over experience. But is that second marriage? Maybe. Let me tell you, ever since the Iran-Iraq war, Iran has focused not on building up their conventional forces, but they have focused on two things: building up the Navy so they can cause havoc within the Persian Gulf region, and expanding their proxy forces, which is mainly the Quds Force, the IRGC, the Hezbollah and Hamas as proxies as well. And what this allows them to do is affect other nations, affect their enemies in the region, affect their allies in Latin America, for instance, who are their allies against us, in ways that allows them to maintain plausible deniability. In the Bill Gertz piece yesterday, there were declassified documents that talked about the expansion of the Quds Force in Venezuela. And although I hate to read rather than speak extemporaneously on this, I think to get the detail of some of these documents, I'm going to have to. But let me say, above all else, the tactics of asymmetric warfare are to propagate the survival of the regime. And that goes for Iran, of course, as well as Chavez now, Daniel Ortega, which we will get a really good glimpse at in the next elections, as well as Ecuador and Bolivia, and hopefully not too many others in the future. The method of utilizing proxies and gaining perimeter footholds has been the modus operandi of Iran in its arm's-length war with Israel. Since Ahmadinejad was elected in 2005, he has consolidated power in Iran by utilizing the Basij militia to suppress opposition while embedding the Revolutionary Guard Corps in positions within the government and its bureaucracies. Since the end of the Iran-Iraq war, Iran decided not to develop a conventional force structure. Similarly, after narrowly surviving a coup in 2002, Hugo Chavez first purged his military of any soldiers that appeared supportive of the coup, and soon after began to indoctrinate his military in asymmetric warfare. At the first military forum on asymmetric war in 2004, Chavez instructed his soldiers to change their tactical thinking from a conventional style to a people's war, which glorifies the tactics used by revolutionary Islamists. Chavez then had a special edition of Peripheral Warfare and Revolutionary Islam printed in Spanish and distributed to the Venezuelan army to replace the U.S. Army Training Manual. This new training manual idolizes Islamic terrorism, calling it the ultimate and preferred method of asymmetric warfare because it involves fighters willing to sacrifice their lives to kill the enemy. The manual also contains instructions for making and deploying a dirty bomb. And I printed as many copies this morning as my printer would put out before it surrendered. But I underlined in the copy of the manual where it shows how to make a dirty bomb, and I'll cover that in a minute at the end of this. This peripheral warfare strategy was road tested in Iran in its 2006 proxy war with Israel, when two of its surrogate forces, Hezbollah and Hamas, utilized special missile crews to bomb Israeli citizens, as well as to cause distraction when it fired upon Israeli border patrols to start the Israeli-Hezbollah war. Even prior to this decision to remove Saddam Hussein in 2003, Iran was perfecting the use of peripheral warfare by supplying and training Shiite groups in Iraq. Iran also used the strategy against Egypt when it built up a presence just south of its border with Sudan in order to support terrorist operations against Hosni Mubarak's government, and it helped subversive groups in Yemen that could threaten Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure. In April of 2009, Egypt arrested members of a Hezbollah cell consisting of Egyptians, Lebanese, and Palestinians that were smuggling arms to Hamas. A week later, Egypt arrested 4 agents from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps that had been sent to Egypt to set up an intelligence network. Egypt, a longtime foe of Iran, had to contend with its own potential insurgency via the Muslim Brotherhood, which also has close ties to Hamas. The major difference between Iran's use of peripheral warfare in the Middle East and Venezuela's is that the latter can much more easily find allies in the region willing to overtly offer support, whereas Iran must maintain some semblance of plausible deniability in its subversive activities. The correspondingly lesser scrutiny and import given to Latin America allows Chavez to openly tout his Bolivarian revolution throughout the region. Aside from the use of Alba houses, peripheral warfare conducted by Hugo Chavez has included setting up the Venezuela Information Office here in Washington and hiring PR firms to improve his image in the U.S. One of the propaganda coups has been the notorious campaign with Joseph Kennedy, if some of you have seen these commercials, to supply cheap heating oil to down-and-out New Englanders who enjoy a standard of living only dreamed about by poor Venezuelans who suffer constant electricity and food shortages on top of a newly devalued currency. The exclusivity of Chavez's access to oil has allowed him to subvert corrupt politicians in the region, as well as to offer sanctions-busting 20,000-barrel-a-week deal to Iran. But it is this benign neglect policy of the United States towards Venezuela that may also end up being the very thing that entices Chavez to overstep. A favorite quote of Hugo Chavez is, "I will put my enemy to sleep so that one day he will wake up dead." These subtle subversion measures are designed to gain a military or propaganda advantage without provoking response from a superior enemy. What we are really talking about is what our threshold of concern, and that's the phrase that's often used by practitioners of this, is what is the United States' threshold of concern, or how much can be gotten away with before we react? What we're really talking about is threshold of concern. What line must be crossed before we're no longer able to choose to respond as an act of prevention, but instead are forced to respond as an act of retaliation? One of the things that Doug Farah talked about at this event last year was the pipeline that actually you could say it runs from Tierra del Fuego all the way to the Rio Grande to the Gulf of Mexico, but you can put any inert object, let's say in the tri-border area of Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, or a person, let's say a live or inert object, and it will get to its destination basically with the reliability of FedEx or UPS here in the United States. And as Luis mentioned, this when Iran goes nuclear, which looks more and more inevitable as we go along, maybe it's a good possibility that Venezuela may as well. And I think as we get closer to having to act against a nuclearized Iran, one of the vast possibilities may not be an al-Qaeda type attack on the United States, but you could send let's say a Venezuelan, a Nicaraguan, and a Cuban out of the tri-border area, train them there, send them up the pipeline, one to Tijuana, one to Matamoros, and one to Fort Hancock, Kentucky, get them across the border and set off a dirty bomb in the remote desert. No deaths, no casualties, but it's a signal, and it will let the United States know that if we attack Iran, or if even Israel attacks Iran, that this will go off in the center of Los Angeles or New York. Am I close enough? I'll leave it at that optimistic note. We can cover it on questions and answers. Thank you.
John, thank you. The complexities and challenges of asymmetric warfare are clearly something we've got to be focused on. Gustavo Coronel, former member of Congress in Venezuela, will tell us about the rise and, from your lips to God's ears, fall of the Bolivarian Revolution.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. As you know, Chavez came into power 11 years ago. And he came into power because he promised to eliminate corruption in Venezuela. Of course, corruption in Venezuela nowadays is the most intense we have ever had. So he failed in his main electoral promise. There are only two problems with the name he gives his movement. He calls it a Bolivarian revolution. The problem is that it's not Bolivarian, and it's not a revolution. A revolution, of course, is radical change to improve things. But in his case, he has done a radical change to make the country worse than ever before. And of course, he couldn't be farther from being a Bolivarian-inspired revolution. Now, he has developed a political model. He has developed some key strategies and some main tactics. The political model is almost identical to the one Fidel Castro developed in the 1960s. It has to do with authoritarian rule at home, trying to become a regional leader, and in the world, trying to become a leader of a global anti-US alliance. His main strategies are based on three pillars, three main supporting pillars. Oil money. He has had so far no less than $900 billion of income in 11 years. Second, the support of the armed forces, which are co-opted. They are being supplied with abundant privileges and money by Chavez. And third, a real following among the poor. Many of the poor support Chavez because Chavez has expressed interest in the poor. But of course, like if you take Venezuela as a bus, what he has done is he has put the poor into the bus, but at the expense of expelling the middle class from the bus. And that's no solution, of course. You cannot include a sector of the population at the expense of excluding another sector of the population. Now, his main strategies or tactics have had to do with handouts at home and abroad. In fact, his policy is one of giving fish out, not teaching anyone how to fish. And as you can imagine, when the fish runs out, people getting fishes will be more dependent and more defenseless than ever before. Second, he has given money abroad, about $35 to $40 billion has been given to his friends, ideological friends in Latin America. Third, he has been working within OPEC to try to reduce oil production levels so that oil prices can keep increasing. Four, he has been financing the extreme left in Latin America, in almost every country. Peru, Argentina, Chile. 5 of his ambassadors have been expelled from these countries because of intervention in the internal affairs of these countries. He has been aligning himself with the rogue states all over the world. I mean, his club now includes Iran, of course, Syria, Libya, Cuba, all the good guys. And then he has done quite a lot of recruiting in the US. He has done recruiting, especially in Hollywood. He has become Hollywood's favorite dictator. Now, what are the results of these strategies and his tactics? Number one, he is still popular. He's running about 40% popularity, which is very high, except that before, a few years back, he had 70% popularity. He has gained influence in Latin America and the Caribbean by giving oil to the small countries which import oil. He has converted Venezuela in the preferred ally, and I would say almost the only ally of Iran. He has made inroads in the United States. You listen to Joseph Kennedy III, and he's very enthusiastic about Chavez, or you listen to the academic, certain sectors of the academic world in the US, also very enthusiastic. Hollywood, of course. Danny Glover got $18 million to make a picture that he will never finish. And he has become very influential in the OAS, not only because he has acted very shrewdly, but because Insulza has been a disaster as a Secretary General. And in the OPEC, he has not made any inroads because Saudi Arabia, of course, is a leader in OPEC. So he doesn't control how the production can increase or diminish. And in the Latin American area, he has done quite a lot of good work, I would say, proselytizing the small Caribbean countries because of his Petrocaribe initiative. That means oil in exchange for bananas and black beans and that sort of thing. Now, what is the outlook? 11 years later, the revolution has stalled. He can no longer win in his original conception of winning. Now he is surviving. He can no longer make Venezuela into another Cuba. He can no longer make the region into a socialist bloc. He's now surviving. The oil money now is less than before, and that means losing friends. Friends are there as long as money is there. The currency has been devaluated. There is a tremendous electricity crisis in Venezuela. There are food shortages. Crime rate is the highest in the hemisphere. We have 60 violent deaths per 100,000 inhabitants in Venezuela, even more so than Salvador and Mexico in Latin America. So we are now witnessing what is a really impending implosion of the so-called revolution. High-level followers have been leaving him. The vice president left, and he took his wife along because his wife was minister. He has lost several ministers already. He lost a key governor in the state of Lara. In fact, he lost the entire political party. The so-called PPT, Patria para Todos, is no longer a Chavez follower. They have divorced. And the whole thing seems to be crumbling down. The polls show that his popularity has been highly diminished. So my outlook, or my prediction, if you wish, probably with a small component of wishful thinking, is that Chavez will not finish his term in 2012. He will be ousted before 2012. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. That's, as I said, I hope not so much wishful thinking, but accurate forecasting. But we appreciate very much your background on how some of these trends are working within Venezuela, and it certainly informs the rest of the region as well. We come now to Dr. Norman Bailey. We'll hear a bit more about how that Iranian presence that John talked about and its techniques of asymmetric warfare are playing a growing role in both Central and South America. Dr. Bailey.
Thank you very much, Frank and Nancy, and good morning to everyone. In February of last year, I traveled to New York to brief the staff of the District Attorney of Manhattan and the New York Federal Reserve Bank on the Iranian situation in Latin America. Subsequently, District Attorney Morgenthau, as one of his last acts before retiring at the age of 90 at the end of last year, did an extraordinary thing. He came down in September and warned the U.S. government and public and the media about Iranian penetration into the Western Hemisphere. He might just as well have thrown his talk into the Hudson River or the Potomac for all the good that it did in terms of anybody taking any action as a result. In any case, the presentation I made at that time has morphed through various versions since then, and the most recent version was published last month by the University of Miami Center for Hemispheric Policy, in part of their series on challenges to security in the Western Hemisphere task force, of which I was a part, and it's entitled, "What are the Persians doing over here?" And there are some copies here that maybe you'll put it towards the end over there. Remarkably little attention has been paid to this, and yet I will make the case that Iranian involvement in the Western Hemisphere is a direct threat to the national security of the United States, whereas Chinese and Russian involvement, although contrary to the national interests of the United States, is not a direct threat to the national security of the United States. There has been some work done on it. One good report was done by Douglas Farah, the gentleman at the far left, and one of the best, as a matter of fact, was done by an Israeli analyst. Morgenthau's own talk, and most recently the Woodrow Wilson Center published a monograph on the subject. I'm going to talk just very briefly about the involvement of Iran in the Western Hemisphere outside of Venezuela, and then I'm going to devote most of my time to its involvement in and through Venezuela. Iran opened an embassy in Nicaragua, and it has a large staff made up of agents of the Iranian security and intelligence forces, and their area of operation is Central America and most specifically Panama. Iran has done various deals with Ecuador, has signed various deals, I should say, rather than done various deals, because the Iranians are famous for signing things and promising things and then not doing them, but then they get the credit for them, because when they sign them, you have publicity, newspaper, and television, and so on and so on. And the fact that they never happened does not get into the publicity machine. But most recently, the most interesting thing in Ecuador is that many of the financial activities of Iran, which are used to evade financial sanctions on the part of the U.S., the EU, and the UN, have moved from Venezuela, where they have been attacked by, particularly by the United States Treasury Department, which is the only agency of the United States government that has been active in opposing Iranian penetration, and has moved to Ecuador. Various deals have been signed with Bolivia. Recently, uranium mining exploration deals were signed with Guyana in return for money, which caused the Guyanese could do it only by violating a contract they had with a Canadian company to explore the same region. Argentine involvement in the tri-border area, where Hamas, Hezbollah, and Islamic Jihad raise money primarily. And the most interesting thing outside of Venezuela, as far as I'm concerned, is the developing love affair between President Lula of Brazil and President Ahmadinejad of Iran. I think this is very significant, it's very interesting. President Lula, during his administration, has followed what I call the pre-pattern. That is, conservative internally, radical externally. And then you keep the left happy because you're doing radical things externally, while in fact you're governing in a rather conservative fashion. And that is extremely unhelpful to the United States. All right, Venezuela. I've already mentioned about finance. The Iranians have set up various financial institutions in Venezuela, which are used for the purpose of evading financial sanctions, and these have been sanctioned by the Treasury Department. Industrial, including nuclear. There is, Venezuela has signed deals with Iran as well as Russia to develop nuclear power. As far as industrial industrial installations are concerned, there is a map in the report which shows how widespread these installations are throughout Venezuela. There are tractor factories and cement factories and all kinds of other factories that have been set up by the Iranians. The only problem is that the tractor factory doesn't make tractors and the cement factory doesn't make cement. The tractor factory makes weapons, and the cement factory is used for the export of cocaine. A cement plant is the perfect, a so-called cement plant is the perfect warehouse for cocaine, because the powder, which after all looks like cement, is packed in bags that say cement, and then is exported as cement. And it is exported very largely by a fleet of ocean-going tuna boats, which are the perfect way to transport cocaine, because the tuna's on top, the cocaine is underneath, and the smell of the tuna masks the cocaine. And then it goes over to West Africa and is transshipped to Europe. I'm going very quickly because my time is very short. Okay. Transportation, there are weekly flights between Caracas and Tehran, stopping in Damascus. Half of these flights are Venezuelan airliners, half are Iranian airliners. The only problem with these quote-unquote commercial flights is you can't buy passage on them. If you go into the office in Caracas and say, I want to go to Damascus, I want to go to Tehran, they say, wonderful, go someplace and make an arrangement. You say, well, wait a minute, don't you have a flight leaving on Wednesday? Yes, but it's full. It's always full. It's permanently full. And since the Venezuelan government has expropriated all the ports and airports of the country, there is no way of penetrating the dense fog that covers their operations. And these flights, the people on these flights do not go through customs, they don't go through immigration, they don't go through any bureaucratic procedures whatsoever. But the cargo area is always full. The Iranians and the Venezuelans set up a joint shipping company. Then when the United States sanctioned that, they simply changed the name and set up another shipping company and so forth. And the Turks intercepted a shipment that was marked tractor parts, which turned out to be parts of weapons and materials to make explosives and so forth. Energy, the Iranians and the Venezuelans are great allies in OPEC and otherwise, and the Iranians have been given areas in Venezuela for exploration. Drug trafficking, I've already mentioned, and a lot of the drug trafficking is used to finance the activities of Hezbollah and Hamas through their, and FARC, through their installations in Venezuela. Proselytization among indigenous groups. The Wayuu tribe has become Shia Islam. That tribe is on the border between Venezuela and Colombia, which makes it very useful for various purposes. I've already mentioned support of Hezbollah and Hamas. Now, why is Iran doing all of this? Since in the entire 5,000-year period of the Persian Empire, there has until recently been absolutely no interest whatsoever on the part of Persia/Iran in the Western Hemisphere. I put it on the table that it is to make it possible for Iran to retaliate against the United States if it is attacked by the United States or by Israel. Okay, recommendations. 1, put certain Venezuelan banks and some of their affiliates on the sanctions list. 2, declare Venezuela a state sponsor of terrorism so that certain actions can be taken, particularly boycotting Venezuelan oil exports to the United States. Simultaneously with this action, it should be announced that an equivalent amount of crude oil will be released from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve for the time necessary for the market to adjust to the measure. The oil in the SPR is, in any case, of superior quality, and at this point, Venezuelan shipments to the United States are only about 850,000 barrels per day. 3, patrol the mouth of the Orinoco River, because that's where most of the drugs go out, and they go out directly into the Atlantic. Look at your map, not into the Caribbean. 4, monitor much more closely Iranian activities in all the areas outlined above, as well as in other parts of the continent, particularly Panama. And, Mr. Chairman, I return back the remaining 5 seconds of
The
my
balance of your time. An exercise in discipline that is most appreciated. Thank you to all of the panelists for making their remarks within the allotted time, with the exception of Luis, who kindly yielded his back without having finished his remarks. Let me just, if I may, ask if there is something you wanted to say on Russia and China that we could just quickly introduce, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. Yes, mostly I think, Norman, you said that China is not really a security threat. Directly not, but at this point, China increased the investments in Latin America by 400%, and that increase was tremendous, particularly in the last 2 years, from 2007 to 2008. So not to speak about the fact that a Chinese company actually is controlling the Panama Canal, right? And in addition, China is taking over what the U.S. left vacant in Manta, not on its own will, obviously, because Korea expelled it. So when China has this economic leverage, and particularly the strong alliances with Chavez and allies, I think it will help perpetuate Chavez and allies, and that's the threat. In other words, helping perpetuate. In addition, Chavez, at this point, and this is something that actually the person who pointed out is Larry Damon, a scholar of democracy, who said that democracy is in trouble today because China's economic growth and increasing influence in the world enables it to support and even bail out authoritarian regimes. That means that China is not interested in democracy, is not interested in being pressured, please democratize or push for democracy. Therefore, it will tend to support these authoritarian regimes. And I think the same could apply to Russia, unless it depends if Dmitry Medvedev follows the footsteps of Putin, that will be the case. So at this point, you have two major superpowers, if you wish to call China and Russia powers, supporting this Chavez revolution and allies. And that's where the danger is coming from, not a direct danger.
Great, thank you. I'm glad we got that in particular to the extent that it may, this infusion of Chinese loans or forward payments for oil may provide some life support that makes your wishful thinking a little bit more wishful. So let's open it up. We don't have microphones, I don't believe, so we would ask you to speak volubly. Identify yourself, please, and your organization, if you have one. And I will try to repeat the question as best I can so that it is picked up by Telesur and other outlets that are present here today. Ken Timmerman.
Ken Timmerman from Newsmax. Norman, can you expand a little bit on that scenario that you described at the end of your talk, where Venezuela could be used by Iran to retaliate against the United States or Israel in the event that Iran itself is attacked? How do you see that actually happening?
Question is, how could the Venezuelan base be used for retaliation by Iran?
Well, it's not just the Venezuelan base. I would say it's primarily in two areas. One is to interfere with traffic in the Panama Canal. That would be actually remarkably simple to do. I mean, recently a man was found beheaded in Panama City. Turned out to be one of the divers who attaches cylinders of cocaine to the hulls of ships before they go through the canal. Then at the other end in Rotterdam or wherever the ship is going, they're alerted that there is a cylinder or two. I have to go vote. And in the hull of this particular ship, and is taken off at that stage. Well, this diver turned out had stolen 15 kilos of cocaine from the cylinder, and this was the cartels saying, we don't like that, don't do that, warning the, anyhow. If you can that easily put a cylinder of cocaine on the hull of a ship, you can put a cylinder full of high explosives on the hull of a ship also. And then you blow up one or two or three of them in the middle of the canal, and you've got a hell of a situation trying to reopen it. The other thing is that the Iranians have mined the oil facilities in Venezuela, the refineries and the pipelines and some of the port facilities, oil-related port facilities. And this has been done with Iranian technical assistance and members of the PDVSA workforce. PDVSA is the state oil company of Venezuela, have been trained in how to trigger these devices. So those are the two principal ways in which the Iranians have arranged to attack the interests of the United States should they be attacked. And let me just mention, if Israel does the attack, the United States will be blamed for it. I don't want anybody to be under any, even if Obama goes on worldwide television and says, don't do it, don't do it, I hate you, Netanyahu, and so on and so forth, the Iranians will say it was done with the support and collaboration of the United States.
Thank you. Next question.
Will retaliate against us.
Any other questions for this panel? Yes, sir. Can you identify yourself, please?
I think Douglas Farah, who's a very high-ranking official in the military, recently
Propaganda network.
Here it sort of sounds like it's just taken for granted that this is a fact. And it also reminds me a lot of what the type of things we were hearing before the war in Iraq about weapons of mass destruction. At that time, it was many people like yourself talking about how it was assumed that these weapons were there, and we had to take preventative action, as Mr. Perdue was talking about, or suggested that we take in the case of Venezuela. As it turned out, there weren't.
Okay.
Talking about a lot of
Your question is, are there connections, in fact, between the Venezuelan government and the FARC?
No, that's not my question.
I thought that was your question.
No, I haven't asked. I'll ask my question.
Okay. Could you ask your question quickly so we can get on to the answer?
My question is, are you suggesting that, and whoever would like to respond, are you all suggesting that the U.S. government take preventative action, like military action against Venezuela at some point?
Okay. I heard two questions. One is, are there, in fact, connections between the FARC and the Venezuelan government, or is this really just another house of cards used to justify perhaps military action against the regime? Who would like to answer that question? I think we have several takers. John?
For one thing, I would say if we're going on a standard of predominance of the evidence, that as more and more Raul Reyes documents come out that were captured from his computers, I think the links will be solidified, let's say. As far as military action, absolutely not. I don't think anybody here is suggesting that. Anything that we would do militarily would be retaliatory. The thing I am suggesting, or the only thing I mentioned, was the fact that there are soft measures now that could be taken to thwart or parry these soft subversive efforts that Venezuela makes now to counter them. So you do not have to ever do any kind of military action, which would be retaliatory. Who else wanted to take that? Let me stop
Gustavo,
there.
did you want to get in on this?
No, I just wanted to mention that Venezuela today is a totally militarized country. The popular militia created by Chavez is by the thousands. I am not saying that they are very efficient, but they are there. They are a reality. So for all practical purposes, Venezuela is on a war footing. But I don't think, and I wouldn't recommend the United States taking any action on Venezuela. My impression is that Chavez is imploding. If the U.S. did not do anything, Chavez would implode. So there is no need for a U.S. invasion.
Norm Bailey?
Well, I'm not sure that I agree with my good friend Gustavo. Plus, I don't consider it terribly encouraging that Chavez may not last until 2020. This is, 2012. Oh, thank you. You said 2020, I believe. But anyway, okay, now I'm much more encouraged.
That's much more upbeat.
Yeah, okay. I mean, thank you.
Norm, I thought you might address yourself to the evidence of the connection between the FARC and the
evidence is
Venezuelan
simply
government.
overwhelming. I mean, it's like saying that the Holocaust didn't take place, or the Armenian massacre in 1915 didn't take place, and when you've got documents, you've got pictures, you've got everything else, and it was all authenticated by Interpol. I mean, this is disinformation and misinformation carried to the extremes. I mean, call it FARC denial as opposed to Holocaust denial.
And among other things, as I recall, there was a certain hard drive that provided
yeah.
very clinical
Oh, yeah,
documentation of this
absolutely.
connection.
I mean, the evidence is absolutely overwhelming.
Okay. Any other questions?
Douglas Farah
Yes, ma'am.
documented it. Yeah.
Yes. Actually, if you remember April 2002, and there is, of course, the author of a wonderful book on that, the Silence and the Scorpion. Brian Nelson is here with us somewhere in the audience. In April 2002, Chavez was ousted as a result of a gigantic popular march and the reluctance of the army to fire on the protesters. And this is exactly what is going to happen from here somewhere in time before 2012. The situation in Venezuela is such, there is a very high level of frustration, not only among the opposition to Chavez, but even among the own Chavez followers. Because as money dwindles, so loyalty dwindles. I mean, the art of keeping everybody happy at the same time is only possible if you have enough money to go around. But Chavez is now getting in great debt. He has quintupled the national debt. during his 11 years, and he's now mortgaging the oil of the Orinoco area to the Chinese for this $20 billion. I mean, which is anti-constitutional and illegal. But I definitely believe that the popular protests in Venezuela are increasing, will keep increasing, up to a point in which the combination of popular protests and the army rejecting Chavez orders to repress them will result in the ousting of Chavez, just as it happened in April 11 of 2002.
Excuse me, just a second, ma'am. Luis?
I just want to disagree with Gustavo on this. I believe that, when people say that Chavez staying in the regime depends on oil money or on legitimacy, it doesn't. I think people are underestimating the revolutionary will of Chavez. I think Chavez can stay forever in power for a long, long, long time. And he understands that his legitimacy is going to fade away. I think already the support is about 37% for Chavez. This is why he's building an alternative totalitarian infrastructure. In other words, an infrastructure like the one that Iran has, with sort of revolutionary guards, if you wish, militias, that will protect his regime. So I wouldn't take for granted. I think it is wrong for American, U.S. foreign policy makers to think that Chavez is going to last as long as he, as long as he loses his legitimacy or his oil money. I think he can stay for a long time. Look at Fidel Castro.
Norman Bailey?
Yeah, one factor that Gustavo didn't mention is that Venezuela now has the highest inflation rate in the Western Hemisphere and one of the highest in the world. That's another effect of the Bolivarian Revolution, quote unquote. Also, it was not mentioned, when China makes advance payments on delivery of oil, the idea is, oh boy, they're going to pay the market price and so on. They don't. That's a myth. In the first place, the Venezuelan mix doesn't get the international price because it's heavy sour crude, by and large. It gets about $10 a barrel less than the international price. The international price is $80 a barrel. Venezuela gets about 70. And the deals that are made by the Chinese are not at even the price for the Venezuelan mix. It's usually in previous, I don't know about this deal, but in previous deals, it's been about $15 less than the price, so that instead of 80, it would be 70, but it's not 70, it's $55 a barrel, and China has now got a claim on Venezuela's oil production for the rest of time.
Wow. Jon Perdue.
Two quick things for the correspondents from Telesur. One thing is this increase in Quds force that are coming from Iran and Venezuela is a signal of one of two things. Either Chavez thinks his support is sinking, or one of his Alba contemporaries thinks he is, maybe Daniel Ortega, or I would say Correa, maybe needing more training. But the other thing is there's a case going on right now in, I believe it's Caquetá, Colombia, of Jaime Cienfuegos, and I've started getting documentation that's coming out of that case that are releases from the Raul Reyes documents that are starting to show all the vinculos, or the links between Piedad Córdoba and everybody else that's been reported previously, but where these documents have been held until now, we've not been able to get them. Now they're starting to come out as caseloads increase and as these things are adjudicated.
Are there any questions from people other than Hugo Chavez's information operation? I can see a hand up, but I can't see anybody. Go ahead, stand up, sir, if you would. Go ahead.
My question is directed to Norman Bailey. Given the plausibility of your scenario, the vulnerability of the Panama Canal, given the relationship between China and Iran, if there were to be an attack on Iran, do you really believe that the Chinese would permit the Panama Canal to be obstructed?
Well, first of all, I don't think anybody would ask them if they were going to permit it. Secondly, I do have to say the new government in Panama is much more security-minded than the previous government, and is taking a number of measures to protect the canal during the construction phase for the expansion of the canal, as well as patrolling the Caribbean side and the Pacific side of Panamanian waters, and has in train security systems for the free zone of Colón, which is kind of the tri-border area of North America in terms of nefarious activities, as well as the border between Colombia and Panama, which is almost totally open at this point for rest and recreation of FARC people, and also the movement of arms and other products back and forth. And of course, we're, as the Congress people pointed out, we're of course rewarding Panama by refusing to take the free trade agreement to Congress.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Visiting Bogota last week, the Secretary of Defense, Frank Gates, said that he didn't have any appreciation of Chavez's link with FARC, for example. On the other hand, he said that he didn't see any significant problem of the Iranian inroads in Latin America. How does this reconcile with what we are hearing this afternoon?
Surely if Robert Gates doesn't see any problem with the FARC or the Iranians, there can't be a problem. Does anybody disagree with that view?
Well, I know about Mr. Gates. Of course, I don't know what goes on in the mind of Mr. Gates, but there is plenty of evidence about the links between Hugo Chavez and the FARC. I mean, as Norman says, I mean, tons of documents. And in fact, videos, I have some in my own records. I mean, there is no possibility of denying these links any longer. So I think probably Mr. Gates was just misinformed, but we have to ask him.
John?
For one thing, this is not too far afield from what the past statements or diplomatic speak that has come from either the State Department or the administration that say benign neglect. It's a strategy to say that. And the other thing is it depends on what the definition of a link is. Maybe Hugo Chavez personally does not have a link to, enough of a link to call it a link, but certainly subordinates do.
I think it's important to mention that Chavez has admitted he has links to the FARC and supports the FARC. I mean, this is, I don't know, this is like Adolf Hitler saying, yeah, I killed all those 6 million people, and then saying, well, it didn't happen, you know, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is ridiculous, quite frankly.
Let me just add my own 2 bits on this. As the Venezuelan press is having a hard time accepting, I think, the evidence here, it's troubling, to say the least, that the United States government is characterizing the relationship between the FARC and the Venezuelan government as it is, and that it is simply choosing to ignore the obvious security implications of having the Iranian regime itself and its surrogates now operating with impunity in our hemisphere. As I said in my opening remarks, I don't consider this benign neglect anymore. This is malign neglect. And people will be killed as a result of it. And I'm afraid that they will not only be people in the parts of this hemisphere south of our border, they will be in this country as well. It is irresponsible not to be looking at this kind of information, this documented information. Some of it even is coming out of the Pentagon itself, for crying out loud. That report that Bill Gertz featured prominently in the Washington Times yesterday was drawn from the Pentagon's own report. It is inconceivable to me that the Secretary of Defense could actually be indifferent to the presence of Quds forces in our hemisphere, which his own department has documented is not only happening but is accelerating. Any other questions from people other than the Venezuelan press? Yes, ma'am. The Sao Paulo Forum. Why are we not paying attention to this particular threat, John?
Thanks, Chelsea. There's a book published by Alejandro Peña Exclusas exactly about that, and I sent it to Chelsea last week when she saw me at the luncheon on last Monday. But this has been spoken about. It's actually a manifesto of exactly everything we're talking about. It lays out exactly what Hugo Chavez, Fidel Castro, Lula, and the rest of the actors right now are doing. It's a diminution of the military and throughout Latin America. It is a plan to, over time, and this is a long-term plan, and it's been carried out step by step so far. But the Foro de Sao Paulo is what she's talking about, the Sao Paulo Forum, which took place, what year was it, 93?
Yeah, immediately after the Cold War was, or 90, early 90s.
And it was just a plan of all the leftist leaders and actually the ex-communist parties or communist parties in Latin America to get together and to form a strategic plan. And it's we talk about it fairly often, but it tends to get old because it's as old as it is now, but not too many people seem to pay that much attention to it or heed it.
If I can, yeah. You want,
I want to say that Lula and Fidel Castro were two of the main actors in the formation of the Foro de Sao Paulo.
And I would say that this, Hugo Chavez is using his partners in the Foro of Sao Paulo to expand the Bolivarian revolution. And I think the Foro of Sao Paulo, in a way today, was moved to the margins because the Bolivarian revolution took over. And
They hold a meeting every year. They hold
yeah,
a big,
they do.
Could I ask,
And they are linked to Chavez.
in this
very much
regard,
linked to Chavez.
in this regard, the mention that was made of Lula's external program in contrast to the one he gets such credit for internally, how is he playing the Sao Paulo Forum? And is this, in fact, further evidence of what you've described, Norm, as a very troubling sort of double game?
Well, I mean, to his credit, he has never pretended to be anything else than a radical when it comes to foreign policy. I mean, he isn't saying one thing and doing something else. I mean, he attends the meetings every year. He's a great ally of Chavez. He's become a best buddy of Ahmadinejad, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this isn't anything new. This is he's been on that side of things since the very beginning. Of course, there's an election later this year, and we can all keep our fingers crossed because if his candidate wins, he will continue to be president of Brazil.
The Kirchner model, I guess, right? Gustavo.
Just a comment on this. Ahmadinejad, Lula just visited Iran a few weeks ago, and before he went, he said, or maybe he didn't, but he was going to. Oh, okay. But he did say publicly that you have to be very careful, he said, with Ahmadinejad because he's a basket case. Now, we have another basket case in Latin America, and that's Hugo Chavez. That's why I go and visit with him every 3 or 4 months to keep him in check. Can you imagine a president of a Latin American country saying this? And that was in the newspapers in Brazil.
Presumably he meant it in the best sense of the word, whatever that is. Luis?
Yeah, I want to say something on the president of Brazil. I don't think he's a Chavista. I think he has moved a little bit into a more pragmatic, but eventually I think he's an enabler. I think it was very responsible on the part of Lula da Silva to really visit Iran, to really say that Ahmadinejad has the right to deny the Holocaust. And of course, in a way, he also spoke about the right of Iran to have a nuclear weapon. So in a way, I think Lula da Silva, even though domestically he has moved to, to a more pragmatic side, he included conservatives in his cabinet. I think in reality, his ideology still pays lip service to this ideology, and I think is very, very dangerous. And he thinks he's being even. So I agree with you. Let's cross our fingers and hope that his party loses in October.
The conservatives in Canada, in his cabinet, were all on the economic side. His foreign minister is extremely leftist.
Amorim.
Yes.
Yeah.
However, to give the devil his due, he did not say that he supports Iran's right to nuclear weapons. He said to nuclear energy.
And that's always, of course, the entry point to the nuclear weapons program.
Right.
Doug Farah, you're going to be speaking momentarily. Do you have a quick question?
I'll address there, but I think one of the things with the photo of Sao Paulo, like Luis said, is that you now have the Movimiento Continental Bolivariano, which has supplanted the photo as something much more FARC-controlled and much more directly under Chavez's control, and I think he likes that better.
Oh, good. We'll get into that more. I think we have time for one more question in the yellow tie. Okay. Anybody follow that? This was a very complicated question. I think an important question. Norm, you addressed yourself to the issue of the implications of Venezuela not being considered a terror-sponsoring regime. Sanctions. How might that work? Could this Chinese bailout of Venezuela be applied in the future to Iran as well?
The premise of the question is not accurate. There have been sanctions applied, particularly financial sanctions applied to Venezuela, mostly by, in fact, almost entirely by the Treasury Department. Both institutions and individuals have been sanctioned by the Treasury Department. So the premise is not accurate. However, should the U.S. government be doing many other things? Absolutely, and I outlined them in my remarks.
But specifically on this question of whether it is a state sponsor of terror, was that not one of your recommendations?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it was.
And there's no question in your mind it qualifies?
Yes.
Okay.
It certainly qualifies, yes.
Okay. Great.
And
well, we've come.
I said that both times I testified before Engel's subcommittee here in this building.
You are nothing if not consistent. Thank you, Norm. I'm getting a call in from the sideline. Okay.